Thank you, everyone, for attending the Needham Healthcare Conference. It's my pleasure to introduce Robert Blum, President and CEO of Cytokinetics.
Thank you to Needham for inviting Cytokinetics to provide this update. Thanks to you here in the room and those who may be listening in on the webcast. I'll be providing a corporate update for Cytokinetics over these next 25 or so minutes, and in particular talking about our pipeline of investigational medicines directed to diseases and conditions of severe muscle dysfunction and muscle weakness. And we start our presentation with pictures of some of those patients who inspire us, who we know quite well and personally, who tour our labs and who provide feedback and guidance as to what will matter most to treating patients with these most severe, devastating diseases. I'll be making some forward-looking statements, and I'll refer you to our recent SEC filings, including our recent 10-K, with regard to caveats to these statements and underscoring that we don't make any obligation to update these statements. So as mentioned, ours is a company that is focused to the biology of muscle, and in particular, our mission is to discover and develop new medicines, investigational medicines, that may improve the health span of people suffering from these severe diseases of cardiovascular and neuromuscular muscle weakness and muscle dysfunction. The company is powered by science. I mention that because we are one of the few companies, even as we have a late-stage pipeline that continues to innovate, continues to invest in new discoveries. A majority of our employees are involved in research and development, and we continue to pioneer and lead in the space of muscle biology. The cornerstone of that research is the sarcomere. This is a picture of the sarcomere. It's the fundamental unit of muscle contractility. It's a multi-protein complex comprised of an enzyme called myosin and regulatory proteins called tropomyosin and troponin, and a filament called actin. These work together in a concerted, coordinated fashion to achieve mechanical force in muscle cells. These proteins differ by isoform depending on what muscle type, but ours was the first company to establish a high-throughput industrial screen, a biochemical screen, in order to be able to form in 384 well plates in robotic automation the ability to screen millions of compounds against this structure, mixing and matching the proteins, the isoforms from different muscle types in order to establish selectivity, high affinity, specificity, etc. As such, over the years, and our company is now in its 21st year, we've screened over 20 million compounds against this structure, and our medicinal chemists have optimized hundreds of different chemical series that are focused to these molecular targets, the result of which are two verticals in our company, one directed to cardiac muscle, one directed to skeletal muscle. And you can see on the left we have activators and inhibitors of cardiac muscle. On the right we have activators of skeletal muscle. And over the years, we've conducted a large number of clinical trials, over 50 clinical trials, mostly as funded by our partners, in order to be able to interrogate this pipeline of investigational medicines and advance these compounds, as well as backups and follow-ons to mitigate risk. And as you see us now in 2019, the company has a mature pipeline of compounds discovered by our scientists that have advanced through to late stages of development and clinical trials. Foremost amongst them is omecamtiv mecarbil. It's a first-in-class cardiac myosin activator discovered over 15 years ago by Cytokinetics scientists, advanced into the clinic in 2005, the subject of 18 completed clinical trials, and now in pivotal studies in phase 3 under our partnership with Amgen, which was signed in 2006. I'll have a lot more to say about omecamtiv in a moment. AMG 594 is a more recent addition to our clinical development pipeline discovered jointly under our collaboration with Amgen. It's a first-in-class cardiac troponin activator in phase 1. And we also have in phase 1, rapidly moving to phase 2, a next-in-class cardiac myosin inhibitor. This compound discovered at Cytokinetics is not part of our collaboration with Amgen, and it follows behind a compound that we discovered on behalf of MyoKardia, another company. That compound, mavacamten, now in phase 3, is proceeding to validate this biology for potential treatment of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We now have a second compound that we believe may have best-in-class properties in phase 1 moving to phase 2. That's our cardiac vertical. Our skeletal vertical comprises activators of fast skeletal muscle troponin. One such compound, reldesemtiv, is in phase 2. This is all under our collaboration with Astellas, and this has been the subject of a positive phase 2A study completed and announced last year in adolescents and adults with spinal muscular atrophy, and soon will be the subject of a presentation of data from a phase 2 trial called Fortitude ALS, those data to be presented publicly on Sunday, May 5 at the American Academy of Neurology meeting. In ALS, the hope is that this investigational medicine may slow the decline of respiratory function, where those patients ultimately die of respiratory failure. We also have in that pipeline CK-601, another compound, same mechanism, different chemotype. That compound is in IND-enabling studies under our collaboration with Astellas, in which we continue to perform joint research under their sponsorship. And as depicted at the bottom of the slide, we also continue to do research in areas of muscle contractility as well as energetics, growth, and metabolism of muscle. We hold the position that muscle biology is going to be an increasingly important area of new pharmacology, especially with the aging demographics. Milestones for the company coming up in the near term. As I mentioned, we're going to have results from Fortitude ALS just in the next few weeks. We're proceeding towards database lock. We have not yet locked the database. Once that occurs, we will perform the analyses, generate tables, listings, and figures, and those results will be presented on May 5. That's an important milestone, not only for this company, but for patients with ALS who are so desperately in need of a new medicine. We also expect to complete enrollment in GALACTIC, an 8,000-patient outcome study with omecamtiv I'll speak to in a minute. Towards the remainder of the year, you can see milestones as we expect data from our phase 1 study of CK-274 and to be advancing that compound into phase 2, continuing enrollment of the second phase 3 trial with omecamtiv called METEORIC, and continuing the conduct of a phase 1 study of AMG 594. I'll now drill down on our specific programs, starting with our cardiac muscle programs. And here, we're focused in particular to heart failure and heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Heart failure is a growing epidemic in this country and others. Over 6 million patients have heart failure today. That number is expected to grow substantially over the next several years. This is the number one reason why people in the United States are hospitalized. It's the number one reason why people with Medicare are hospitalized. And we're doing a very poor job of treating these patients with existing medicines, all of which were developed for other purposes, none of which were developed specifically for the treatment of heart failure. Those medicines, mostly antihypertensives, have been repurposed for the treatment of this disease. And despite advances with those medicines, we still have unacceptably high mortality rates, higher than that of most cancers, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. If you are diagnosed with acute heart failure in a hospital in the United States, you have an unacceptably high risk of death and morbidity, as evidenced by the high hospitalization and readmission rates, as well as the high 1-year and 5-year mortality rates. 30% death at 1 year, 50% at 5 years. We need new medicines to keep people alive and out of the hospital, and that's where we think ultimately omecamtiv may play a role. In that space, we also have unacceptably high economic burden. Heart failure costs attribute to the single largest line item in the Medicare budget, a function of about 1/3 of Medicare costs, in large part because Medicare is bearing the brunt of those hospital readmissions. So when we think about heart failure, we think about the many different phenotypes of patients with various unmet needs. Heart failure can be subdivided into categories, about half of whom have decreased cardiac performance or contractility. That's heart failure with reduced ejection fraction as an example. But also there's a growing number of heart failure patients with cardiac fibrosis who have preserved ejection fraction, but also have low cardiac function and performance. And we think as a company focused to cardiac muscle, we have an opportunity to make a meaningful dent in the universe for these patients, but with different mechanisms, different drugs attributed to different subpopulations. In particular, for the roughly 3 million patients in the United States with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, as mentioned, we need a new medicine that can reduce the high mortality and hospital visit rate. But we also need drugs that don't affect renal function, don't affect blood pressure, drugs that don't increase heart rate, drugs that don't increase oxygen and energy demand, and drugs that can affect and improve quality of life. When we set out to discover the first medicine specifically for development in the treatment of heart failure, we looked at existing drugs and the liabilities of those drugs, and we tried to design and engineer into omecamtiv mecarbil a compound that could increase cardiac performance without increasing calcium intake into the cardiac myocyte, could increase cardiac function without increasing the velocity of cardiac contractility, but rather the duration of cardiac contractility. And over the 15 years that we've been at it, we think we discovered that, and we've demonstrated that in over 18 clinical trials already completed. Most of these were performed by Cytokinetics as reimbursed by Amgen. This is perhaps the most robust clinical trials program ever conducted for the potential treatment of heart failure. And through the course of over 15 years working in this space, we have learned a lot about safety, tolerability, pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics. We've learned about formulations and what types of assessments and what types of subpopulations we should be studying. All of that setting the table for movement of omecamtiv into phase 3, which occurred in 2016. That was primarily informed by the penultimate phase 2 study that we conducted, now published, called COSMIC. And in that trial of hundreds of patients with chronic heart failure, we saw over 20 weeks duration of treatment, a time-dependent increase in systolic ejection time that corresponded with increasing dose and exposure of oral omecamtiv mecarbil. You can see that reflected here. Systolic ejection time is that amount of time that the left ventricle is contracting, which corresponds importantly with increased stroke volume, fractional shortening, and ejection fraction. Those are measures of increased cardiac performance. What we didn't know to expect, but we were very, very pleasantly impressed and surprised to see, was that as one increases cardiac performance with this mechanism over 20 weeks duration of time, the heart begins to change in almost a reverse remodeling sort of way. You begin to see the otherwise hypertrophic baggy hearts that grow larger with disease progression actually beginning to shrink. End systolic and end diastolic volumes, end systolic and end diastolic diameters began to decrease. And correspondingly, we saw decreases in heart rate and NT-proBNP, which is a measure of cardiac wall stress. All of these contribute to a constellation of factors we don't believe has ever been seen in any clinical trial before, suggesting that not only is the heart achieving improvements in cardiac function and performance, but also restoring some of the lost efficiencies that have occurred with progression of disease. So this was incredibly encouraging as we advance to the conduct of GALACTIC. This is a study being conducted by Amgen. It's an 8,000 patient outcome study that is due to a complete enrollment in the next few months. This is a trial that is measuring as a primary endpoint the composite of time to CV death or first heart failure event, most of which will be heart failure hospitalizations. But this study is powered with over 90% power for time to cardiovascular death. So it has the potential to be the study that includes the most deaths of any heart failure trial, and already has accrued more deaths than any other heart failure trial in North America. That's by design. We want to see that this drug has the best opportunity to demonstrate a clinically meaningful and statistically significant reduction on cardiovascular death across patients enrolled in this study. These are generally higher risk patients, patients who are within 1 year of a recent hospitalization for heart failure. This trial has enrolled over 7,000 patients towards the objective of 8,000 patients, and recently was the subject of an announcement. We recently announced together with Amgen that GALACTIC passed through a futility analysis performed in support of the Data Monitoring Committee's review and oversight of this trial. The Data Monitoring Committee has been meeting roughly quarterly over the last couple of years, so they've already met over 8 other times to review unblinded safety data. But there was a formal interim analysis which was triggered by our having accrued a minimum threshold of deaths in this study. And the Data Monitoring Committee reviewed the unblinded data in detail, including safety data, recommended that the trial not be stopped for futility, rather instead proceed without any alteration and changes in the conduct of the study. That's a major de-risking event, something that we're not surprised by, but still encouraged by. And in that way, this study continues, will complete enrollment, and proceed to the next interim. The next interim, which is scheduled to occur roughly 1 year from now, will be providing for, again, another analysis by the Data Monitoring Committee. It could provide for the early stopping of the study were there to be futility at that point, or otherwise the early stopping of the study were there to be determination that there was an overwhelming efficacy, something that we think is possible, maybe not probable, but still something to be aware of. If this study then proceeds to full term, where we would expect the accrual of the threshold events, that study would read out in 2021. So this is a study that's within 1 to 2 years, we believe, of reading out its results. This is a pivotal study we believe could support registration with an agreed SPA with FDA. At the same time, that study is enrolling and will soon be complete in its enrollment. We began recently enrollment in a trial called METEORIC. This is a second phase 3 trial of omecamtiv mecarbil. This trial is being conducted by Cytokinetics as reimbursed by Amgen. And this trial affords us the opportunity to test the hypothesis, does omecamtiv mecarbil contribute to increased exercise performance or extended exercise endurance as measured by cardiopulmonary exercise testing? This is not critical path to the registration, but we think could be quite meaningful in differentiating omecamtiv mecarbil relative to other treatments for heart failure. This is the trial study diagram. It's also described in clinicaltrials.gov. It's a study that we expect will enroll patients over 1 to 2 years and should also read out, we expect, in 2021. I mentioned our collaboration agreement with Amgen. It dates back to 2006 when Amgen acquired an option on omecamtiv mecarbil. They paid us to do additional phase 1 and phase 2A studies. They reviewed the data. They exercised their option by paying us an additional sum in 2009. We then proceeded to conduct further phase 2 studies together under their sponsorship. They expanded the collaboration in 2013 to include Japan. Over the years, we've earned through upfront payments and sponsored research and sponsored development and milestone payments several $100 million already from Amgen, and we still are eligible for over $300 million in pre-commercial milestones, $300 million in sales-based milestones, and royalties that start in the teens and climb over 20% of sales. We had an option, as omecamtiv moved from phase 2 to phase 3, in which we could co-fund phase 3 in fixed dollar increments. For every 10 million up to 40 million we co-invested, we could buy up our royalty 1% up to a maximum of 4%. Back in 2016, we exercised that option. Over 8 successive quarters, we paid Amgen $40 million. And in doing that, we bought up the royalty 4%. We turned around and sold that incremental royalty, 4.5% actually, to Royalty Pharma for $100 million. This was back in 2017, still preserving a royalty that exceeds 20% of sales. Just by that transaction alone, back in 2017, one should associate our retained economics as in 2017 dollars, accruing to roughly then $500 million or more in economic value. I underscore that and mention that today because our market cap today is under $500 million, our enterprise value closer to $250 million. So this is a program for which I think it stands out for its quality of development, its duration of development, the extensive data that supports movement in phase 3, the validation that comes from Amgen's continued commitments, and also Royalty Pharma's benchmarking of the potential upside in the royalty. I'm not aware that Royalty Pharma has ever done a deal for an asset that was then 5 years away from potential commercialization. That's because the commercial opportunity in heart failure is so large, as recently evidenced by Entresto, Novartis's Entresto surpassing $1 billion in its sales. This is a drug that is a good drug. It competes with generic enalapril and other ACE inhibitors, and it's on track based on Novartis's estimates to do at least $3 billion in annual sales based on the indication of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction alone. This provides one reference standard or benchmark for what could be the potential of omecamtiv mecarbil, which with its novel mechanism of action, increasing cardiac performance, I would suggest, should hopefully do at least that much. So now I'll turn attention to another cardiac muscle activator under our collaboration with Amgen. It's AMG 594. It's a first-in-class compound which may provide opportunity to extend and expand a franchise we may build together with Amgen in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. This is a compound that's in phase 1 in a single and ascending multiple dose studies with the goal to have these data inform potential progression to phase 2 and how we might approach the phase 2 planning, what types of patients. That's all to be shared with you once we have the phase 1 data. I'd now like to focus to the other side of the coin. We've been talking about heart failure with impaired cardiac contractility. There are patients living today with a disease called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It comes in different forms, obstructive and non-obstructive. This is a disease of excessive contractility for which a cardiac myosin inhibitor may hold promise to relax cardiac muscle, reduce pressures, and reduce outcomes associated with that disease. The therapeutic hypothesis here for CK-274 is described here, the goal being to relax hypercontractile tissue and reduce high left ventricular filling pressures. CK-274 is a next-in-class compound following behind another compound I previously mentioned called mavacamten, which was synthesized in our laboratories by our scientists and provided to MyoKardia, an independent company. We have milestones and royalties that we earn on mavacamten, and we continue to believe in its promise. But we do think that there's an opportunity with CK-274 to demonstrate properties that may afford even better class profile. In particular, described here, CK-274 appears to have a distinct binding site, which may afford certain advantages. It has a shorter half-life based on preclinical evidence and a more shallow PK/PD dose-response curve that we believe may afford also ease of use and better titratability and therapeutic index. That's reflected in some of these preclinical data, as will also hopefully be borne out in clinical studies to follow. We've also seen with longer-term dosing of CK-274 in preclinical models reduced cardiac hypertrophy as measured by reduced interstitial fibrosis. We think this is extremely encouraging for this compound in diseases associated with excessive contractility or even where there may be preserved cardiac performance but also other syndromes that contribute to heart failure. So we are currently conducting a phase 1 study consisting of nested SAD and MAD dose escalation cohorts. SAD stands for single ascending dose, MAD for multiple ascending dose. These data should be available in Q3, informing progression into phase 2 in the second half of this year. And here we expect to see evidence of shorter half-life, tolerability, safety, and echocardiographic parameters in healthy volunteers before we may proceed to then phase 2 depicted on this slide. We expect to be in phase 2 later this year and hope to have those data reading out next year for then what could be proceeding to phase 3 by the end of next year. We intend to conduct a robust phase 2 clinical trials program comprised of both patients receiving treatment and those receiving placebo standard of care, and we'll have more to say about that clinical trial design upon initiation. So just to sum up our milestones with regard to cardiac muscle, you see them all here. It's an extremely busy time for the company on that side of the house. It's also a busy time on the skeletal muscle side of the house as we're developing reldesemtiv, our fast skeletal troponin activator. It's been demonstrated to be potent and well tolerated in 5 phase 1 studies. And here you see side by side data demonstrating increased force frequency response relative to tirasemtiv, a predecessor compound we were developing a few years ago, but which we suspended in favor of reldesemtiv because we believe it is better tolerated and also potentially more efficacious. Reldesemtiv has been the subject of a completed phase 2A trial in adolescents and adults with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy. These are primarily type 2 and type 3 patients, and where we conducted the first placebo-controlled trial evaluating an investigational medicine in this population. And we dosed patients at low dose or medium dose or high dose in patients with SMA, placebo-controlled and over 8 weeks duration treatment. And we saw evidence of effect as measured by increases from baseline in 6-minute walk distance. Reldesemtiv, by activating skeletal muscle, increases muscle force and power and endurance, and that's best evidenced here in 6-minute walk distance, where these patients were able to increase their distance walked in 6 minutes in a dose-dependent and plasma-concentrated related way. 6-minute walk distance is a validated endpoint, as already demonstrated approvable in a number of other indications, and recently FDA communicated to us that it could be an approvable endpoint in SMA as well. So we're particularly encouraged about those findings, especially because we believe that the population of adults with SMA will grow, with SMN-directed therapies demonstrating impressive evidence of effect in type 1 infants in particular. We expect this population to be living longer, but with impaired skeletal and ambulatory muscle function. So now we're focused to reldesemtiv in not only SMA, but also ALS. And this follows behind our previous evaluations of a predecessor compound I mentioned, tirasemtiv in ALS. Tirasemtiv in 2 large trials conducted a few years ago demonstrated impressive reductions in the decline of respiratory function as measured by slow vital capacity in patients with ALS. a disease for which there is no treatment to treat impaired respiratory function. In BENEFIT-ALS and in VITALITY-ALS, for those patients who tolerated tirasemtiv, we saw nominal statistical significance in slowing the decline of vital capacity, in one case over 12 weeks, in the other case over 24 weeks. Both of these trials enrolled over 700 patients, but unfortunately about a third of the patients in each trial did not tolerate tirasemtiv because it has an off-target effect. Unrelated to its primary clinical pharmacology, tirasemtiv crossed the blood-brain barrier, activated GABA receptors, and induced lightheadedness that contributed to about a third of the patients dropping out of the trial, thereby confounding the intent to treat analyses on the as randomized patients. Many patients who were on tirasemtiv dropping out early and contributing data to the primary efficacy analyses, albeit not on study drug for months of duration. So we decided to, rather than keep pushing tirasemtiv forward, suspend its development in favor of reldesemtiv, which comes from a different chemical class, different chemotype, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, isn't associated with dizziness. And we conducted a trial called FORTITUDE-ALS, looking at 12 weeks duration treatment, low, medium, and high dose versus standard of care, in the same centers, using the same assessment and the same assessors as we did previously with tirasemtiv. And we believe that this trial, as designed, benefits from our learnings and has the potential to demonstrate an effect for this mechanism, but for a molecule that may be better tolerated than reldesemtiv. We are proceeding now to database lock. We completed enrollment in this study last year, and as such, we look forward to these results in the next few weeks. We've announced recently that they'll be presented on Sunday, May 5, at the American Academy of Neurology meeting, and we're quite hopeful for this, especially in light of the urgent unmet need in ALS. Our collaboration with Astellas is structured very similarly to our collaboration with Amgen, but for different territories. In this case, like under the Amgen collaboration, Astellas pays us sponsored research and sponsored development. We have options. We earn milestone payments that exceed $600 million, over 300 pre-commercial, over 300 based on sales, and again can earn royalties that exceed 20% of sales. In this case, we're developing reldesemtiv and similar compounds, both in neuromuscular and non-neuromuscular indications. And whereas with Amgen we have co-promotion rights in North America, with Astellas those co-promotion rights extend North America and Europe. So the important milestone coming up for Cytokinetics in this program area is the results from FORTITUDE-ALS to be presented at AAN on May 5. I'll end the presentation by mentioning a few things from the corporate side. Our Vision 2020, we're executing and realizing progress against a vision we set out a number of years ago, which has us not only developing but commercializing new medicines rooted in muscle pharmacology, and especially in markets where we build goodwill and reputation with strong patient advocacy groups, and in customer segments that are highly concentrated and tractable to a company like ours with more limited access to capital and where the return on investment can be higher. From a corporate development strategy, we've been executing all along on a plan that has us monetizing and leveraging our expertise in this muscle biology in deals. And as you can see here, we rely principally on our partnerships to fund the development of our portfolio and pipeline to enable not only financial diversification but risk mitigation. And that's contributed over our financing history to a majority of our paid-in capital coming not from dilutive financings but from partnerships. And we expect that to continue, especially as now we are looking to the possibility of earning larger and larger milestone payments from our partners. As mentioned, over $1 billion of potential milestone payments from Amgen and Astellas, and that does not include the potential to earn royalties that exceed 20% of sales on partnered products. From a balance sheet standpoint, we reported our Q4 financials at the end of last year were about $200 million in cash and cash equivalents. That represented over 2 years of cash. Given our guidance for spending net of revenue this year, we expect to be spending between $85 and $90 million. Here's our cap table. The company's market cap is roughly $450 million today, an enterprise value of about $200 million. And with that, I'll repeat our milestones and close the presentation and invite any questions you may have.
Any questions from the room? Just to really make sure that we understand, the second interim for the Galactic study that will be coming next year will be either a stoppage for futility or a stoppage for efficacy?
Correct.
Continuation without change.
Correct. The question related to the second interim analysis for Galactic planned to occur based on achieving a next threshold of cardiovascular death. That could provide for the early stopping of the trial were we to see overwhelming efficacy, but also were the Data Monitoring Committee to determine that it was futile to continue. This is a trial by which the Data Monitoring Committee has its own discretions, or they could recommend that we continue the trial without altering its conduct in any way.
You also mentioned a bit about the shifting landscape in SMA. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so as you know, Spinraza has demonstrated very impressive results on type 1 infants living longer with the disease, but still missing motor milestones, still not having full function, and that's expected to produce a population living longer with impaired muscle function and weakness. We don't believe that gene therapy will be curative in this disease. Even as gene therapy shows great promise, there's not evidence to suggest that these are patients that are living absent disease progression and dysfunction and weakness. In fact, we're already aware of patients that were on gene therapy that switched over to Spinraza, suggesting that there's a population that's going to be living longer after having received SMN-directed therapy that could still benefit from an oral therapy that could be complementary in its mechanism and for which patients could live a life maybe with the benefit of medicines with complementary mechanisms that could extend function and survival.
If I remember correctly, Spinraza also has certain limitations related to people who have undergone fusion.
Yeah.
And spinal cord.
Yeah, not every patient will opt to receive Spinraza or, for that matter, gene therapy based on mode of treatment. So we expect that an oral therapy may also have certain advantages.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interest in our company.